Well, here in these stories, we see something that I think is a couple things that are really important that I want us to highlight. One of the key tasks of being a disciple of Jesus, of being a follower of Jesus, of being one of Jesus's apprentices, if you put it in those terms, is to discover our identity and our calling. God has a particular calling and purpose for each one of us, but he's also created us and given us a special identity, and it's important that we understand and that we know those. 1,500 years ago, Augustine of Hippo prayed, "Grant, Lord, that I may know myself, that I may know thee." Because it's vitally important that we understand who we are and that we understand who God is so that we can come together and serve him appropriately. If we don't know who we are, we're going to have a difficult time answering the call that God gives us. And so I'm sure that you've heard from me enough that you know that I'm about discipleship, and it's discipleship this and discipleship that, and being a follower of Jesus and being a disciple of Jesus. And I'm convinced that that's absolutely crucial. And sometimes it's more helpful for us to talk in terms of being an apprentice, like you would be an apprentice to an electrician. A master electrician, you would want to learn how to be an electrician. You would apprentice under a master. And the same thing is true for a disciple of Jesus. We want to serve under Jesus so that we can learn to be like the master. Jesus lived the life that God intended for us to live, and so we need to learn to follow and to live in his same manner, to be transformed because sin has corrupted our hearts and our lives. So we need to be transformed into the image of Jesus. And if we're not intentional about it, the world is really good at making disciples. So if we're not intentional about seeking after God and following Jesus and being a disciple of Jesus, we're going to find ourselves being molded and shaped and conformed, or you might even say deformed, into the ways of the world. And so it's vitally important as Jesus begins his ministry that he understands and he knows his identity and he knows his calling, but also all of his disciples and everybody who was gathered around, they recognized that Jesus knew his identity and his calling. And so in these two stories, beginning here in Matthew chapter 3, where we read about the baptism of Jesus, and the Father responds, "This is my beloved Son. This is the Son that I love, and whom I'm well pleased." And so there's this identity that is placed upon who Jesus is. And then we see in the temptations of Jesus in Matthew chapter 4, if you really are the Son of God, if you really are the Son of God, turn these stones to bread. If you're really who you claim to be, if you think that you are the Son of God, then why don't you do some miracles? Why don't you do something special like that? Now, this title, the Son of God, is a special title. It wasn't just given to anybody, but it was given originally to Israel and the people of Israel, that they were the Son of God. But more particularly, it was given to the Messiah. Remember we said the Messiah was the anointed one. It was the king. It was the deliverer. It was the one that Israel was waiting for, looking for, to God to raise up a Messiah that would set them free from their bondage of sin, set them free from the bondage of oppression from other nations. But they were looking for this Messiah. They were looking for this Son of God who would come and who would be their deliverer. And so here is Jesus, who takes on the identity of being the Son of God, who takes on the identity of being the beloved Son of God, but also he takes on that role, that calling, that purpose of being the Messiah, of being the Son of God, and living that out. You see, it's important that we understand who we are, because what we do flows out of who we are. What we do flows out of who we are. And so it's the case with Jesus here, who is the Messiah, and how he lives, it flows out of how he lives. When we recognize that we are children of God, that God has created us in his own image, that we are set apart from the rest of God's creation. When we recognize that, it's much easier for us to accept the purpose for which he's called each and every one of us. And I think it's interesting when Jesus is tempted, he's not tempted with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Jesus is tempted with, are you really the Son of God? He's tempted in his identity. That's where the temptation comes. And don't you think if the enemy thought that that was a worthy temptation to put for Jesus, he would think that it would be a worthy temptation to bring towards us as well. And what we see in the world that we live in is certainly the case. But it's not just Jesus who knows his identity and his calling and his purpose. We could go through the Bible and we could see a number of characters that we read about in Scripture and how they are given their identity and how they are given their purpose. In John chapter 1, we see how John the Baptist, how when the religious leaders come to him and say, who in the world do you think you are? You're out here at this river baptizing people. Who do you think you are? What are you doing out here, man? And so the religious leaders, they send the investigative reporters, they send the private eyes out to check in on John. In John chapter 1, verses 20, he confessed, and he did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ, John the Baptist says. And they ask him, what then? Are you Elijah? He said, I'm not. Are you the prophet? He answered, no. So they said to him, who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? And he said, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the ways of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said. John knows his identity. He knows his purpose. He knows his calling, what he's about. He's focused in like a laser on this. And you can see how effective he was at doing his job, doing his calling, doing his purpose when he knows who he is. When he's confused about who he is, it would be difficult for him to stay that laser focused. But because he knows who he is, he's able to do what God's called him to do. There's another example from the New Testament in Matthew chapter 16, and this is the only other one I'll share because we could do hundreds of these through the Scripture. But Matthew 16, beginning at verse 13, Jesus and his disciples, they're traveling. They've come to the district of Caesarea Philippi. And he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? What's the word on the street about who I am? What are you hearing about what people say about who I am? In verse 14, and they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And then he makes it personal. He says to them, verse 15, but who do you say that I am? And Peter responds, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So Jesus he turns the question from who do people say that I am, and he turns, to who do you say that I am? And when Peter responds on target, absolutely correct, then Jesus gives Peter his identity and his calling. You are Peter. You are the rock. And on this rock, I'm going to have you help build my church. And the gates of hell are not going to stop my church from being built. And we see this incredible testimony that comes out over and over again as God gives us our identity and God gives us our purpose. From Jesus, John the Baptist, and Peter, they all know their identity, they all know their calling, and they're all able to be effective instruments of God as a result. Well, like all of them, we were created by God. And God has given us a special identity. Image bearers. We were created to be in right relationship, to have a relationship with the living God. We were created to be able to walk and commune with God. This is how God originally designed for all of us to live. And then with that relationship, he's able to give us a purpose, to go out and manage his creation, to go out and have dominion, to go out and be the people that God's called us to be, us as individuals. But identity and calling, that's a little bit of a new thing in the world that we live in today. Really, because for thousands of years, there hasn't been a whole lot of discussion, because if your father was a farmer, chances are you're going to be a farmer. I mean, that's the world that you live in. That's the only world that you know. You're raised in that environment, and that's who you become. And so for thousands of years in different cultures around the world, that's kind of how it was. If your dad was a mason, then you might have picked up the mason trade. If your dad was a fisherman, then you might have picked up the fisherman trade. That's how we lived. That's how we would respond to our identity and our calling. But with Christianity and Western civilization, we've had a new discovery with personal freedoms. And we've had this new discovery with this personal freedoms that we're not locked into this box anymore, are we? We have the world available to us. And maybe you've heard this before, maybe you even said this to your own children or grandchildren. You can be anything you want to be. And maybe you've even told your kids or grandkids, if you want to be president of the United States, you can be president of the United States. Not that that's anything we'd want our kids to be this day, right? But you see how that would be contrasted to the rest of the world. In some of these other countries, if you wanted to be the king or the ruler or the leader of that nation, that wasn't even in the possibility. No chance of that happening. And so this is radically different. This is a departure, because as we elevate individuals and we elevate the freedoms that individuals have, and we recognize the value that individuals have here in Christian Western civilization, we've also opened up a little bit of Pandora's box with this wide open options that are available, because one of the expectations would be that parents would be involved in this process of helping their children identify who they are and what is their calling and purpose in life. You'd have parents that would be hands-on and be involved in their life and would be good role models for them. But we live in a society now that the family's been destroyed. So much is upset these days in our homes, with dysfunctional families, dysfunctional relationships, even abusive families, abusive relationships. And so young people today, they're not getting any kind of guidance from the families to speak of. They're not getting the role models that they need in our culture today. We've separated ourselves from the church and from spiritual guidance, from spiritual mentors. And if you are given this opportunity that the whole world is wide open to you, and you've got no direction and no guidance, you can see how daunting this is going to be. This isn't going to be a great blessing. It's going to be anxiety, because you're going to just be overwhelmed with all the options that's available to you. What if I make the wrong choice? Well, I've talked to enough millennials and Generation X and young people to realize that this is a pretty common situation that they are going through. That the anxiety that they have over who am I, what am I supposed to be, and we see it in our world today. You cannot find your identity and your calling alone. We are social beings, and we need someone outside of us to help us with our identity and our calling and our purpose. And I know that kind of goes contrary to the popular word today, because, we want to encourage people, just find yourself, be who you are, be you. Figure out who you are and just do it. Nobody has the right to judge. Nobody has the right to tell you how you feel and how you should live. You decide for yourself. You do you. Stephanie likes the sound of music. And so if she has an opportunity to watch it each year, she'll watch it at least once a year, The Sound of Music. And she knows a lot of these songs, and she can sing the songs and knows the music. And there's a scene where there's a wrestling going on in the convent. Who am I supposed to be? I thought maybe I was supposed to be here, supposed to be a nun, and now I'm not so sure that that's who I'm supposed to be. And the advice that's given is follow your heart, right? Climb every mountain, ford every stream, follow every rainbow till you find your dream. That maybe makes for a good song, might make a good poem, but it's not necessarily really great advice. Because the problem is we can't find ourselves alone. It's an illusion to think that we can figure this out by ourselves. We have too many conflicting feelings to be able to decide which one we ought to follow and which one we should reject. On a simple example, I like ice cream, and this past week I had my birthday, so Stephanie made me a poppy seed cake and then homemade ice cream. And so that's my annual opportunity to eat poppy seed cake with coffee icing on it, and she hates making the cake, but I request it every year, and so that's what I get. And so she asked me last night, what do you want for supper? And I said, do you really need to ask? I'll take cake and ice cream and I'll be fine. And she said, just shakes her head. Really? Are you serious? Yeah, I'm serious. I've got this feeling deep within me of who I am. When I look inside, I love homemade ice cream and I love poppy seed cake. And so if I follow my heart and follow my feelings, that's where I'm going to go. But each morning when I go into the closet and I get out my pair of pants and I try to button my breeches, I realize this isn't working so well. I really like cake and ice cream, but, maybe that's not the best thing that I ought to be doing. And then I go see the doctor, and he says, well, you really ought to lose about 15, 20 pounds. It'd help you out. Ugh. So I've got these conflicting feelings, so who am I? Should I follow my heart and follow my feelings and go do what I want to do? Be me? Imagine if I was some member of a German tribe maybe 1,500 years ago. I'm a warrior. And I look into my heart and I see this aggression and violence. I like killing people, anybody who comes against my tribe. I say, well, that's who I am, right? I like doing it. I like the response that comes when I come back victorious to the rest of my tribe and they celebrate me. But suppose I also have, let's say, same-sex attraction. And I choose to reject those feelings because, well, I live in a culture that doesn't accept that. And so one, killing and murder and mayhem, I can accept, but this other I reject because I say, well, that can't be me. I don't want that. But if we fast forward it into today, and I'm walking down the streets of one of our cities, New York, and I'm walking down Manhattan, and I have these feelings of aggression, and I want to hurt somebody. I'm liable to go see my therapist, right? And go talk to him and say, what's wrong with me? Why do I have these feelings? But if I discover I have the same-sex attraction, then I'm going to embrace that because that's what our culture says today. I'm convinced that it's impossible for us to discover who we are and discover our calling by ourselves because our culture has so much influence and so much power in our world that it has influence on us. We're not even aware of it, for good or for bad. Our culture that we live in is shaping us. It's like the water that fish swim in. It's just there. It's just who we are. We don't live in a vacuum. And our culture is good at making disciples of the world. So the Bible warns us not to be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And so I've got a little chart here that I just introduced to you. I'm not going to take time to go through it. But I think I found it helpful, this chart by author J. Robert Clinton. And he talks about the process that we go through, stages that we go through in life as we, are raised in a home, or however dysfunctional or functional it may have been, and we have a foundation that's laid in our life. And then there's this period of discovery, and where we find who we are. And sometimes, in the world today, we see people going to college and they're not really sure what they're going to major in. They change their majors 4, 5, 6 times, and 7 years later they're still not sure, but they've got a mountain of debt, as a result, as they're trying to discover who they are. I'm convinced that this discovery phase is not just an instantaneous opportunity for us. We read these stories in Scripture where Jesus is identified here as, here's my son who I love and I'm well pleased. It doesn't come to us in that same manner just overnight, but it's more of a process. But what I want to highlight on this chart is sort of the two ends of the spectrum. I want to encourage everyone, our young people in particular, I want to encourage them to discover their identity and their calling and their purpose in life, because I think it's invaluable for us, to find out who you are and to find out the calling that you have in your life. I think it's invaluable for you to do this as early as you can. But it's also important for us to, whatever stage of life we're in, to understand that. And I've seen it, especially with, people who retire. They've worked all their life, they've done a job, they knew this is what I do, I'm a factory worker, whatever it is, and I go and I build airplanes in Wichita, Kansas, and I do that all my life, and then I retire, and now what? Now what do I do? Because they don't have clearly identified who they are and what is their calling and purpose in life. And in life, sometimes, with the seasons of life, we adjust, we change, we move. What our purpose and calling might be at this point in time in my life. But if we are rock solid in who we are, and we understand who God's created us to be and what our purpose is, then we can go through the transitions of life and not be too terribly phased. I've seen it from people that you've heard me talk about, like Dallas Willard, and he contracted cancer in 2013, died, but he was a pretty well-known author, but he had a great deal of influence on people. And his influence wasn't so much that his brilliant writings, but his influence was the people that knew him knew that he had a character that matched the kind of writings that he had, that he was the real McCoy. He was the genuine stuff. And so as he was dying, he had this flood of people that were coming out to California to his house, wanted to say thank you, wanted to come visit him. And he was just as kind and gentle in the midst of all his pain and suffering as he died of cancer as he was when he was healthy and doing well. I had a lady in my church in Wichita, Vera Goodson was her name, and she was a sweetheart of a lady in her 90s, and I remember the last birthday that I was in Wichita for, the young adults all wanted to go to her house on her birthday and celebrate her birthday. Now just think about a bunch of 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds going out to this widowed 97-year-old lady to celebrate her birthday. Why would they do that? Because she had a relationship with them in and through the church, and she was just as nice and sweet in her dying days as she was in her early years. And she went through a great deal of tragedy. And she didn't allow that to sour her heart. She understood her identity and her calling and purpose, and she experienced an influence even in her dying days. I had a Filipino pastor, the first Nazarene ordained Filipino, was in my church in Alaska, Pastor Jaime Galvez, and he saw incredible tragedy in his life. During the war, he saw and experienced a number of terrible, horrific events. And you can imagine, as a young boy, he hated the Japanese for what they did to his people, what they did to his family, what they did to his country. He hated the Japanese. And so you can imagine the first time he has opportunity to be pastor in the church and lead in the church, well, here's a Japanese man that wants to come to his church and wants to know about Jesus. And he said, when I saw him, I had a heart full of hate. And I knew that wasn't right. And so I on the outward did what I was supposed to do in saying hello and treating him well, but inside I hated him. And so God began to work, and he experienced God's sanctifying power in his life that changed his heart, and he became a gentle and sweet and kind man. And so here he is in his 90s today. And he's seen all this tragedy, but when you see him and you're around him, there's photos of him up on Facebook, his family will post. And all these people gather around him. They want their photo with Pastor Galvez because he's such a kind and sweet and loving man. And he's had an impact in their life. So on both ends of the spectrum, I want to encourage you to find out who you are and find out your purpose. And I think this happens when we're in right relationship, obviously, with God, but it happens in community with God's people, when we work together, when we minister with one another. So I invite you to walk on this journey of discovery with Christ and with your Christian family. Rabbi Zusa told his disciples, in the next world, I will not be asked, why were you not Moses? I will be asked, why were you not Zusa? At the end of your life, the Creator's not going to ask you, why were you not like your brother? Why were you not like your sister? Why were you not more like this person or that person? God's going to ask us, why were we not who we were created to be? Psalm 139, verses 13 through 14. God says, For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. This is true of every one of us here. There's not one accident here among us. There's not one oops here among us. With God, we are all a part of his perfect good plan by design. That is our identity, fearfully and wonderfully made. Ephesians 2:10, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So God has an identity, and he's got a purpose for each and every one of us. He has an identity and a calling for each and every one of us. And I want to invite you to discover what that identity and calling and purpose is. And who better to help you than the one who created you and the one who loves you? Who better to help you in that process than a family of God that loves you and wants to honor the God who created you by helping you find and discover your place in this world. I've asked Stephanie and Josh to lead us in a closing song, and it's a song that It's a few years old now, but it may be new to some of you. But we'll just close with this song, as I think it speaks the truth to us. And we talk about discovering who we are. So let's join them and sing together.
Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Whom the Son sets free. Oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Realized he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Whom the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. 'Cause I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
I want to invite you all to hold out your hands like this for a moment. I like, as we close the service with a benediction, to do it with a posture of receiving. This posture says, God, I don't have anything in my hands. It says, God, I'm open to what you've got to give me. So may the God of peace, the God who knows you and calls you by name, even to the deepest part of you, give you joy, hope, and peace in believing in Jesus Christ through the power of the Spirit. Amen. You guys may go in peace.